Okay, so we'll continue with the Rambam, Halacha Vav, from the first chapter of Hilchos Shmitta V'Yovel. In Matisas or Be'ishas Hakanim, you don't light a cluster of reeds on fire. So it's a machlokas what this means. Some say Ishas Hakanim is you want to clear off a place. There's a bunch of reeds growing there, so the easiest way to clear it so you could plant on there is to set them on fire. So that's one interpretation. So if you light them on fire to knock them down, and then you'll have land that you could plant in. So you're preparing land so that you could plant on it, even though you're not planting it yet, but you're clearing land away. That's one shot in this phrase. So you can't do that. Mivnei avodas karka. It's considered a work on the land. What do you mean gather?
So when I was there, gathered whole growth together in fire or anything. Gathered things together.
Gathering together is probably not going to be a problem. If it's just stuff that's already on top, and like you, let's say, even use a rake, you might move a drop of earth, but that's not really preparing the land, I don't think. Because that's much less than charisha, than plowing. So just clearing the overbrush. So we see that some things are d'Rabbanan, not permitted because you're getting ready for the next year's planting. You have a question? Mipnei she'avodas karka. So and some say that there is some Eishas Hakanim is some type of worm or bug that lives in the reeds. So if these things damage the trees or the fields, so you lit you lit the pile on fire to kill these bugs. So Rav Kook says in the Shabbos Haaretz, some say that even if it's not in order to make the land ready, you are making the land ready, so it's usher. But if you're doing it to knock down some reeds so that other reeds grow bigger or whatever, so then that would be usher. Okay, ve'ein bodkenes hazran. Okay, ve'ein malamdenes apar lachrosh ala b'chol. You can't teach a cow or a bull how to thresh, because the word lachrosh isn't plowing, is it? It is. You can't teach it to plow except in sand. Meaning, yeah. So meaning it's not so the cow has to be trained. And if you would train it on dirt, you're plowing the land, even though you're not actually going to plant it, because whether it's a problem of what's it called? It looks what's it called? Not lifnei. But because it looks like you're planting, even if you have no intention of doing it, and even if you do it in someone else's field, so it's not a toes for you, you're not allowed to. You have to use sand, so it'll get trained, but there's not going to be any benefit for the act of plowing that's being done. You're not allowed to check out seeds in a pot that's full of dirt or dust, meaning you want to know if these seeds are good seeds or not, they're going to sprout or not. Even if you're not necessarily going to plant them now, but you're testing them now, are these going to be good seeds for when Shmita is over? You can search them in a pot full of glal, which is fertilizer. You're allowed to soak seeds during Shmita, so you could plant them after Shmita. And you can keep aloe on your roof, but you're not allowed to water it. So some say this is aloe, or it's something that's a soft plant, vegetable, type of vegetable that grows by itself. So if it's a yerek, I'm not sure that that it's what we call aloe would qualify because no one eats aloe, right? You only put it on your hands. Okay. So in aloe there's plants that have thick, it's like kind of like a finger, and you crack it off and there's like a lotion in there. You've heard of aloe vera lotion? So it's from aloe is from a aloe plant. So so Rav Kook says that if you check the seeds in a flower pot full of fertilizer and they grew and they started sprouting, you don't have to destroy them, because sometimes Omar saying this word. Sometimes if some things that grew on Shmitta, you have to destroy them. And some things that grew, you have to eat with Kedusha Shvius, and some things that grow, you have to use them only in their best and most, the highest and best use. Okay, what do they use it for? Yeah, it's good for you dry hands or certain types of cuts. It's good. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So I don't know if aloe itself. So that's why I have a big doubts that this plant is actually what we call aloe. But the thing is that aloe plants, if it's not food, then the laws of Shmitta wouldn't apply for it. So we wouldn't be allowed to plant it, because even you're not allowed to plant anything, even if it's not for food. If it grows itself, if it's food and it grows itself, that's svichim, then we're going to learn that stuff is also to use completely. There's a drabanan that you can't use the vegetables that grew themselves. But here, there's another possible heter here, because this says, because it's in a flower pot. So the thing is, there's two types of flower pots. There's a flower pot with a hole and a flower pot without a hole. Oh, excuse me, I'm mixing up two different parts, but there's a lot of actually possible things that this isn't really even the real place to discuss it, but we have to mention because it comes up, and we'll hopefully discuss it in fuller context later, in fuller detail later. But the utzitz is, let's say it's like a flower pot. So there's flower pots with a hole, flower pots without a hole. So if you put a flower pot with a hole on the ground, halachically, it's considered connected to the ground. I think we mentioned this last week. So if you had a flower pot with a hole, if you pick it up on Shabbos, you violated the malacha of harvesting, because it's like you separated something from the ground. So Chaim Kanievsky brings from the Ridvaz, I think, that in this case, even if it doesn't have a hole, it's also midrabanan, and because of that, Chaim Kanievsky says there's no heter at all to plant things, even if it's in a enclosed flower, a closed up flower pot without a hole. So I think we mentioned last week the possibility of growing something in a greenhouse. So right. So from what Rav Chaim Kanievsky mentions over here, which is not the main point of it, that wouldn't be a heter. Not everyone agrees with that, but that's a possible way that you could read into this halacha. If the flower pot has a hole in it, that's one thing, because then it could be connected to the ground. But if it doesn't have a hole, maybe it's a combination of two drabanans or not, and maybe it would be okay. So one way of learning it, you can't test them in an utzitz if it has a hole in it, because it has a hole in it. But if it wouldn't have a hole in it, then it's not connected to the ground, then maybe it's not so bad. And we're going to see. But he says if it's filled with fertilizer, because fertilizer, even though fertilizer is good for growing, that's when you have dirt and you fertilize the dirt. If the whole thing is fertilizer, that's an unusual way of growing, so then it's not awesome. That's what this halacha says. But if you look at the last line in the halacha, this alloy, you could have it on the roof of your house. So Rav Kook says here, you could have svichim, things that grow, you could have that on your roof, and you can even do things to let them live, and you're not worried that there's a problem with svichim. Again, svichim are things vegetables that grew by themselves. Trees that grew by themselves, not a problem. But svichim is a problem on Shmita. And it's not a problem of working on the land because it's not on the ground. So the way I understand that, if it's on the roof, it's not connected to the ground because it's on your roof. And your roof is, whether it's in Rav Kook's time, maybe there were tin roofs, maybe there were some that were stone, whatever, but certainly nowadays, a roof like that, it wouldn't be a problem. So that's what Rav Kook mentions here from the Pasuk Shulchan. And then he goes and and Rav Kook says that some people say you could have all types of things. I don't know if he means leafy things that go up on a roof, but you can't water them. And it's not only for this particular species of alloy, but anything that grows on a roof, you can keep them alive, but you can't water them. And you don't worry about maras ayin. So part of the problem is maras ayin. Maras ayin is when you're doing something that's not usher, but people think it's usher. So maras ayin, the appearance of the eye. So it used to be this shaila doesn't apply anymore. But up until 20 years ago, the following shaila existed. You needed to call someone. So you're passing by and there's a restaurant there that's a not kosher restaurant, but they have a payphone just inside the door. So can you go in and make a phone call? So the problem is it looks like maras ayin, it looks like you're going into a non-kosher restaurant. So nowadays people have cell phones. I think the shaila doesn't apply anymore. But right, okay, so that still applies, right? That's true. So they used to say for something like that, or if you needed a drink because it was a hot day. So they used to say if you're in the middle of a city, you can't because of maras ayin, and if you're in travel on the road, it's okay because there's only very limited places that you could stop in, and it's not a problem to get a drink or to use the phone. That's what the standard answer was. But that's one example of maras ayin. There's other examples of maras ayin. So here, if people would see you tending to some plants on your roof, they might say, "Oh, he's keep taking care of crops on Shmita." And they might forget the detail that you're on your roof and you're not connected to the ground. You mean right? So there's a problem for. You mean for someone to use your cow on Shabbos? Oh, teaching it how to plow. No, so that's not maras ayin, you're saying because it looks like you're plowing. Oh, well, I'm there with it. It can't learn itself. There's no correspondence school to teach a cow how to plow. It needs the person who's going to be plowing it teaches it, so it knows when you say this or hit it like this, it does one thing, But is that because of maras ayin? I'm not sure that's because of maras ayin. I don't think so. So that was the word I was thinking of before, maras ayin. And then Rav Kook has a discussion: are you allowed to dig a hole for a trap for weasels or rats or stuffing in the field? So he has a discussion here. It has to be how close it is to trees. If it's close to trees, you could dig it to make the trap. Now, again, I don't know how relevant this is nowadays with the agriculture there. But in regard to digging a hole to put the trap, that's a shaila, even though you're not planting. But to dig the hole itself is not so simple that it's something that you're allowed to do on Shmita. So then Rav Chaim Kanievsky mentions the other thing about being on the roof. Where does he say it here? She says Yerushalmi, and this is an Orla. We mentioned it last week when we were talking about the greenhouses. The Yerushalmi has a suffix if you plant indoors. So he understands indoors is under a roof, which makes sense. If Shmitta applies or not, and that's only in a case where the house will harm it from growing. It's not going to grow as well under a roof as it would grow outside. So the Pastor Shulchan holds you could be Mekel. So the Pastor Shulchan is an invited student of the Vilna Gaon, and he says there's no Isser D'Rabbanan, and Rucham Kanievsky does not like that opinion and doesn't find any way to be Mekel. But again, if Shmitta is only D'Rabbanan and this is only a D'Rabbanan act, well, then again, we can't say that because there's a lot of things that D'Rabbanan or Asur D'Rabbanan. If we say it's two D'Rabbanans, then you're gonna be doing all types of malachos. So that's not exactly good enough heter by itself. But he says if it's if it has if it's a flower pot that doesn't have a hole and it's under a roof, if you want to be makel, you have on who to rely on. So he's not saying you can. He's not saying you should be makel, but he's saying that there's grounds to be makel because it's a sveka. Maybe they didn't say in Shmita that it's a problem to use an unperforated flower pot, and also in the house maybe there's no Shmita. And since the elder, the Pastor Shulchan, said you could be lenient even if you do it in your house, in an unperforated flower pot, you have what to rely on, whether it's made out of wood, whether it's a ceramic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then here he mentions his father-in-law, who's Rabbi Yashiv. He was still shlit at the time. So he mentioned that that the greenhouses are made for them to grow in. So that's there. You can't be makel in those, because when the Yerushalmi is a suffix, if you grow it indoors, it's not. It might be mutter. It's because it doesn't grow so well indoors. But the greenhouses are made for it to grow well. So then the heter doesn't apply. And then we pointed out last week that Rabbi in talking with the farmers in Dush Katif says that because it's enclosed, it gets too hot and it actually is bad for the trees. So it sounds like he would be Mako when tends to be, Rabbi Ramon would tend to be lenient because the facts are different. So he wouldn't argue on Rav Yasha, but I don't think they asked Rav Yasha with those specific details. Okay. Sorkin as Ilan Besikra. So they would put some type of pitch type thing over on the tree. So it seems to be that it was a way that if your tree wasn't so good, they would paint some type of paint on it, and people would daven that the tree should have a good harvest. So Vitwanin also Bavanim, and you can I don't know, they hung stones from it or something. It was some type of thing they did to, I guess, I don't know if they thought, if the tree thought that it had weight from fruit growing on it, the tree would make itself stronger. You know what I mean? Certain types of medicine, there's a thing called prolotherapy, I think, that if you have an injury on your joint, they do something that actually injures it a little bit more to try to make your body heal it and bring more blood flow there. So I think they would hang these stones. I don't even see, how does it translate? I think they would hang stones from the branch, so the tree would bring more nutrients out. Load it with stones. Oh, I don't have didn't have one for the footnotes here. Let me look that up. So I think that's so these are things, the odrin tachas hagvanim, and you can hoe under grapevines, and also under olive trees. If it's to make the tree more healthy, then it is forbidden. But if it's done to close cracks that are in there, then it's mutter. So Rav Kook mentions that these things, to paint on it or to put the the rocks on it, it's not, it's only so that you put the rocks on it, not that it should develop fruit, but that it should bring more nutrients to the fruit that's already growing. So Rav Kook says you're not allowed to do these things, even if they're just a segula, not a real thing, if you're trying to make it get fruits. And in regard to hoeing, the Pri Chadash says that there's two types of hoeing. That one is to make sure that the tree is on a strong foundation, but so that meaning that you don't want it, I guess, to tip over, whatever. You want the roots to be covered. But if you're doing it so it'll be more healthy, then again, that's also, we mentioned last week, the only things that were permitted is if it's only, you're going to keep it from dying, but you can't improve it. But some say that you're not allowed to hoe for the first time. But if it's a tree that you've hoed it under it in the past, so it might be a different type of hoeing than I'm imagining in my head, then you're allowed to if it's to upkeep it. And he mentions the Pasuk Shulchan brings an opinion that under grapevines, it's not usher because you need to do that to keep the grapes from dying. But it's only forbidden to do it if you're going to hoe the entire vineyard and not just under the grapevines itself. And he says some Rishonim seem to say that when you're mikash case bezesim under the olive trees doesn't mean that you're hoeing, but it's some type of fertilizing. And also within that fertilization, there's two types of fertilizing. One is just to keep it from dying, and one is to make it get even better. So obviously, the one to make it better is certainly not okay. And then there's a third opinion that says that this is to take away the overgrowth or the dead brush stuff. So if you do that, that's to make it better. So that's to make it grow better, then that certainly is forbidden. But you're not allowed to do these type of things in a vegetable patch because it was only permitted under grapes and under olives. Ches. Mashkin beis hashlachem b'shviyas. You should irrigate it. You can water. In those days, they would water by irrigate a field that needed to be watered so the crop wouldn't die. And that is a plowed. It was a field that was already had seeds and it was planted and it's very dry. And if you had an orchard of trees, if they were far apart from each other, that there was less than 10 per a certain half acre, whatever the distance is, you can. So in those days, you would make the water move, meaning you would dig some type of irrigation ditch. So you would have a ditch that goes from tree to tree, but you're not allowed to water the entire field. But if they were close enough to each other that there was 10 for a half acre, whatever the density ratio is, and you're allowed to water the entire field for that. The white field. So some say that those are fields that completely went white from the sun beating down on them. There's nothing green on them anymore. You can spritz some water on there on Shmitta so that the trees shouldn't die. So Rav Kook mentioned, so even if it's irrigated already, you're allowed to help the water along because the Chachamim never said it's usher if they would die without it. But it seems that Tosos, it seems that you're not allowed to do a good watering in an irrigated field, and you're only allowed to sprinkle some water on there because that's only means you're going to water it a little bit as needed. So a little bit as needed is certainly not going to make it grow better, but if you have it well irrigated, that's going to make it better, it seems. And then Rav Kook mentions that some say when I say sprinkling, you can take a watering can and water in the stale oven. That's only for the trees. But if the trees are not dense, there's less than 10 for a base sa'ah, which again, I'm just translating it as a half acre, but it may not be a half acre. Even if it doesn't have any trees, you're allowed to sprinkle it in order if it would get too dry. So they felt that whether it's true or not, if it would get too dry, all the nutrients would leach from there, and then you wouldn't be able to plant the following year. So you could bring some water and water it so it doesn't get too dry. So otherwise the field will be no good for the next year also. But you're certainly not allowed to water it so that vegetables will come out of it on Shmitta. The osin ugios lekfanim. You can make a little hole or a little very small pit near the grapevines to collect some water. If there was some type of pool that used to collect water, it's not a well, but maybe it's for the irrigation. You can make an irrigation ditch during Shmitta for the first time, and you can fill these reservoirs with water. So the ugios are, you make a little bit of a digging so that water will collect in these little holes. And you could also do it for olives. And he thinks, and Rav Kook feels that you could do it for other trees if the trees would deteriorate without doing this. And you can make an irrigation pond. He quotes the Ran and Moy Cotton that it's only if you put the dirt that you had dug out, you put it far away somewhere else. Because if you put it close, it might be good dirt and help the field when you plant in it next. But he says, really, we don't have to worry about that opinion. Okay. So now we're turning the page to page 4 in your handouts. Why did they allow you to do these types of actions on Shmitta? If you wouldn't do that, the whole land would get too dry and salty. Well, I'm saying the word melecha comes from melach, from salt, but it could just also be from dry, I guess. So then again, in those days, if you're by the ocean and you had dried up water, what was left? Salt was left. We're not talking about fresh water. The whole of the Israel, and since these types of actions were only usher rabbinically, so they didn't make any decrees to forbid them except those 4 actions which were usher from the Torah, which were planting in the earth and the 2 avos and the 2 toldos. So I assume he means from this planting and harvesting, and then there's the planting and harvesting of stuff from the ground and stuff from the trees. Let me just look up one thing here. Yeah, okay, so let's continue. Halacha Yud Aleph. Misharabu Anasim, when there were people who were forcing us, there were many people who were forcing us, and when the non-Jewish kings forced us to make camps and stuff for their soldiers, the Chachamim allowed us to plant on Shvius the things that these workers of the king needed, but only for them, not any more than that. And if also someone forced you to work on Shmita and you're not getting anything out of it, like avodas hamelach, so a lot of people would explain that would be taxes, meaning that today the king imposed the tax. So if you don't pay the tax, it's bad news for the Jews. So you're allowed to do that, and I think Rashi and Sanhedrin talks about that also in Sefer. Hareza Osa, you are allowed to do that. So Rav Kook points out that the Rishonim say this is only when Shemitah is D'Rabbanan, but this wouldn't be a heter if Shemitah was D'Oraisa. Some say that there's not a heter to plant in order to pay the king's tax, unless he's going to put people in jail for not doing it, because then that's considered sakanos nefashos. But if it's just because of monetary harm, there's not a heter. And Rav Kook says it's simple that if there's sakanos nefashos, then it's mutter, even if it's Shmita D'Oraisa. And the Rabbi says, this is only talking about places where Olei Bavel did not settle. Okay, halacha yud beis. Seems a little bit strange that would be the Rabbi's opinion, which he quotes the name of the Rabbi. That doesn't feel to be in contact with the Rabbi's own opinion. Okay, so if you planted on Shmita, what do you have to do? You have to uproot it, even if you planted it by accident. Because unfortunately, Jews are suspected of not keeping Shmita properly. And if we would allow it to stay, if you've done it accidentally, people are going to say, oh, I did it accidentally, even though they did it on purpose. So therefore, we have to uproot it all. So Cook says, even if you planted within the last 30 days of Shemitah, meaning it is not considered to take root or whatever for about 30 days or 30 days plus 2 weeks or plus 3 days, there's different opinions. You still have to destroy it. But if it was 30 days before Shemitah, even though you're not allowed to plant then, if you did it accidentally, we would say that you didn't have to do it. But if you did it on purpose, you would have to uproot it. Okay, Yud Gimel. Onara Uzibla B'Shvius. If you plowed your field, or Nara seems to be you did it's a different type of really good plowing. Oh, it's a preliminary plowing. So for Ner, they would plow it twice. Once just to loosen up a little bit, but it's not really ready for plowing, and then you're going to have to plow it a second time. So even if you did only the preliminary plowing, Oziblo, or you fertilized it b'shvius, so or you fertilized it on Shmita, so it'll be better for the year after Shmita. Kontino, so we give him a fine, meaning not a monetary fine, but we punish him and say he's not allowed to plant that field after Shmita either. He's not allowed to hire other people to plant it. It has to stay empty. The imays he's going to know, but if he died, we let his son plant it, and we don't punish the son because of the father. So Rav Kook says, because the Yerushalmi seems to say it's only usher if you plowed it twice. So he says, well, it depends. If plowing it once is going to make it good enough to plant after Shmita, then it's good enough. So that's usher to do, and we would punish him and not let him do it. But if you plow it once and it's not going to be ready for next year, then they didn't decree that it has to lay fallow. Meaning it's not that it's mutter to do, but we don't punish him for doing it. Okay, then he mentions opinion that when the king forces you to plow, whether it's for tax, and according to what we said above, when it's allowed to, you wouldn't be allowed to do a double plowing. So because they only allowed you to plant minimally, you're not allowed to do the super good double plowing. So then he mentioned, we learned in the Mishnayos, and he's going to talk about it in the next chapter, that even though you're not allowed to fertilize the field, if you decide to have your animals graze there, they are automatically going to be fertilizing it for you. So you could only do it up to the level that the Chachamim said you can. Even if you did it so that it would be fertilized, but if you did it according to the limits that the Chachamim set, if you did it beyond what they allowed, then you're not allowed to use that field the next year either, the 8th year. Again, to punish you for doing that. Okay, let's see here. So Rav Kook thinks by himself that when many people would plow on Shmitta, then there was no gzeira that you can't plow on it the other year, because that would be a gzeira that the majority of the community can't keep. And the Chachamim if Chachamim they're not allowed to make a gzeira that the majority of the community can't keep. And if they make the gzeira, according to some opinions, it automatically falls off by itself. Okay, Yodalit. So I guess this is what Marty was asking. If you take away the thorns or the thistles from your field in Shmitta in order that it should be ready for the 8th year, or he took away stones, even though he wasn't allowed to do that, we don't punish him, and we allow him to plow to seed that field in the 8th year. So also the fields that you saw, maybe they were Oter based in. I don't know. So so Rashi said, so Rav Kook mentioned that Rashi and Tosfos say this is when we say that you're removing the thorns in it from it, that's when they're already detached from the ground. But if they were growing from the ground and you cut them down, then you're not allowed to use that field and plant in it in the 8th year. And there is an opinion that's brought down in the Pasuk Shulchan that if you remove the stones, that's only, again, if there were stones on top of the thing that you cut, but if they were connected to the ground, then it's like you were plowing it. So we saw halacha. Well, then he says it depends according to the opinion that if you need to do two plowings to get the land good, so just taking out this layer of stones is only like it's like you would need 2. So since this would still need to be plowed in order to be field, so according to that opinion that it's only usher if you needed to plow it twice to be ready, this is only considered like plowing it once. So it's not mutter to do, but we don't punish you and say you can't use it the next year. But according to the opinion that even if you plow once, you're not allowed, you're punished. Certainly, you'll be punished for that. So we saw halachos in the Mishnayos that you could take off up to the ground, but then you can't take the bottom layer. So even though that's not actually plowing, to actually take the rocks that are in the ground, to actually disconnect them from the ground, that is a form of plowing, and so that's also to do on Shmitta. Okay, Tesvav. Hatomen lafes utznon ochseosen b'shvius. So you had like leeks or radishes, things like that, which grow in the ground, but you could also store them in the ground. So in this case, you dug them in the ground to store them in the ground, not to plant them. But we know if you put onions or things like that, they could start sprouting again, or horseradish. There's actually different shalawot. Horseradish, maybe not, because Yerushalmi, well, we'll talk about this, it's not really this halacha, but there's certain things, and nowadays with people like hot, spicy things, it may not apply because people like, horseradish mayonnaise and what's the stuff they put with their sushi, the green stuff that's spicy, and the jalapeno and your ghost peppers that I think are across the street on Costner someone's growing. So, but there were certain types of things that were pretty bitter, and people didn't eat them. And even one of the species of maror, it was so bitter, people didn't really eat it. And in general, and there's even a halacha that if you had Meiser Sheni money, so it was the first or second or fourth, fifth year of the Shmitta cycle, and so part of the second tithe, you had to separate it and then eat it up in Yerushalayim, or if it's too heavy to bring in Yerushalayim, you're allowed to transfer the sanctity onto money, minted coins, and then bring that money and buy food with it in Yerushalayim. You could buy, it doesn't have to be grown food, you can buy animals and chef the animals, but you couldn't necessarily buy some of these bitter vegetables, even though sometimes people use it for food, but most people would rather not eat it because it's so bitter. So the Yerushalmi later, I think it's in the 7th or 8th parak of the Mishayos in the Yerushalmi, talks about the ulshin, which most people translate as endives. So I think that's included in the halacha about now buying in regularly Meiser Sheni. It is human food, but people don't usually eat it. But it seems in Shmita, when you didn't have as much food, they would eat that stuff too. But here we're talking about vegetables that were normally eaten. So I mentioned horseradish, and then I just went to think this super spicy thing that people didn't used to eat, but nowadays a lot of people like the spicy thing. So we'd have to see how that applies. So if some of the leaves were revealed, you didn't dig them, it's not a problem. But if it's not, it's usher because it looks like you're planting. If you were planting, you wouldn't let some of the leaves from the top of the radishes or whatever be uncovered. But because you left it uncovered, people know that you're storing it there, you're not planting it. If you're storing the wild onions under in the ground, lo yivchos me'arba kaben al gova tefach v'tefach apra gaba. You can't do less than 4 kabin, 4 bushels that are at least 4 bushels that were a tefach high, about 4 inches high, and you need a tefach of dirt on top of that. And you have to put it in a place that people are going to walk over, because if people walk over it, it's not going to blossom and grow more. And you can cut off the top of rice in Shemitah, but you can't cut them with a knife, I guess. So again, Rav Kook says these are types that you're just storing them, you're not trying to plant them. So then he discusses if they ended up growing a little more, it's not a problem. And since you can store them, they're always available, then you don't have to get rid of them in the biur time or declare them ownerless. And you don't have to, but the Rosh in Kalayim says you're not allowed to store them on Shemitah. You have to store them before Shemitah. And then he brings a lenient opinion that says even if you didn't cover all the leaves, but you did it for the sake of storing, it's not a Shemitah problem. And then he says when a little bit has to be revealed, there's a stricter opinion it doesn't mean that some leaves, but you have to have like the top of the radish, underneath the leaf, or that has to be exposed. If that's completely under the ground, then it's usher, then it's usher to do it. And then Rav Kook mentions that some say that this wild onion, you have to do in a certain way, that 4 bushels with a height of a tefach, but for regular onions, you don't have to store that much. But some say that wild onions and our regular onions are the same halacha. And then there's things about the rice. So he explains you're allowed to water rice. So we said it was cutting, but he says that you're adding water to it and you're mixing the water up with some dirt. I guess about the patties that the rice has to grow in. I don't know exactly how that grows. And he says it's clear that rice fields need this type of water, because if you don't do it, it's completely going to die out. And it appears to me, says Rav Kook, that we're talking about you're doing this at the end of Shmitta so that the rice will be able to grow after Shmitta. You can't do it in the middle of Shmitta for it to grow on Shmitta. You're doing it at the very end of Shmitta, so it'll continue to grow after Shmitta. But you're not allowed to do it so that the rice will grow on Shmitta. Okay, we'll leave it here. We'll up to halacha tazayin, which will be our first halacha on page 5. I think we made some good progress this week. And again, whether we use all these types of vegetables nowadays, and we don't necessarily use these forms of storage to bury the onions in the ground anymore, but these are the halachos, and knowing the halachos, sometimes it comes up to situations that we do see.